Hello, this is about actuaries and how actuaries can improve the security of residents in CCRCs. Now, as a matter of full disclosure, I should tell you at the outset that I'm an actuary, and when I moved to the CCRC that I lived in, I simply assumed that these communities were actuarially managed, that they followed actuarial principles, and that they recognized liabilities using the modeling techniques that actuaries use to ensure that life insurance companies and similar institutions are financially sound. I also assumed that the regulatory oversight would be comparable to the kind of regulatory oversight that has allowed people to have trust that when they buy a life insurance policy or an annuity, that the insurance company will provide the benefits promised and that those promises will be fulfilled in a clear and uncumbersome manner. When we come to CCRCs, however, accountants have tended to dominate, and they have resisted, not entirely, but in many instances, the input that actuaries can provide to the accounting process to help give the CCRC the integrity that residents want it to have. Although accountants rely on engineers for assessments of physical assets, they have been reluctant to rely on actuaries for CCRCs. The result is that CCRCs are not as financially sound as they might otherwise be. CCRC accounting statements are not as reliable an indicator of the ability of the CCRC to provide the services on which residents rely as prospective residents are led to believe. Now, this requires some explanation, and that's what I want to do in this discussion. No one would think of buying a life annuity that wasn't developed and priced by an actuary. Actuaries are the experts in the financial consequences of the unpredictable events, including mortality, for example, of human existence. So it's surprising that actuaries aren't also intimately involved in the development of CCRCs. But they aren't. It's the exception that actuaries are part of the management group or the management team or the origination team or the development team for a CCRC. The generality, the conventional practice, is to rely principally on accountants and other financial professions. It's not entirely uncommon that the value that actuaries offer is overlooked. You're familiar with lifetime memberships, which some organizations offer. Lifetime memberships are something which might be actuarially developed. If they were, then the lifetime membership would develop a cash flow that would meet the annual recurring costs in a predictable way and could be expected to provide the promised benefits for the lifetime of the member. Commonly, however, many membership organizations simply book lifetime memberships into cash flow for the year in which they're paid, as though they just had a greater revenue stream for that year, and that money is then expensed away, spent on worthwhile causes related to the organization, but then those lifetime members have an entitlement to membership services for the remainder of their life, and if the money has already been expensed away, there's no continuing revenue to help provide those services. This can be problematic, and that's an area in which actuaries might be involved. Here's an excerpt of people speaking about lifetime memberships and about the value of actuarial analysis for CCRCs.
But how are we ever going to manage if everybody joins as a life member? It's $150 that you're never going to see again from an individual.
But that's why it's not actuarial.
Yeah.
And the dilemma you're facing is exactly the way the providers think about entrance fees and why they get in trouble. Because this is an inherently actuarial business, just like the life memberships, and people don't think they need actuaries.
Well, it's going to be a
We
challenge.
may need to rethink the life member. For example, I'm a life member, and I've already lived 10 years, so that means that $15 a year, I've used it up.
Well, you've got the earnings on it, though. If you invested it,
But we haven't.
AV-PAL is a legitimate
He
actuary.
does consulting work, and he uses an actuarial company in Washington, D.C. to do that work for him.
Oh, I see what you're saying. To do, you mean to maintain the model. And well, I guess it's what you think is actuarial work.
He's basically a good consultant.
Well, that's what an actuary
And
is.
half the companies in Florida use him.
Well, they should.
What time
He
is it?
wrote the book. Do you have his book?
No, but I'm aware of it.
That's the one book that every provider should have read.
You might find this interesting, but 75% of the CCRCs in the United States think it's a waste of money to spend it on actuarial support.
I know that they think that, and that's something that I'm trying to understand.
You can't.
And because I want to try to understand where the providers are coming from and where their leadership group is. Those views are common views. Many providers don't feel that there is much value to an actuarial study, and to some extent the actuaries themselves are responsible for this because they haven't done an adequate job of establishing the value of the services that they provide. Most continuing care retirement communities today rely primarily on accounting standards codifications as the basis for their financial management. This accounting reliance contrasts with the intrinsically actuarial nature of the assurances that CCRCs give to their residents. CCRCs typically promise the availability of a residence and services and the availability of nursing care for the lifetime of the resident when and as those services are needed. It's the providence of actuaries to be able to predict what levels of staffing, what financial resources, what facilities will be required to allow the fulfillment of those promises. Without that actuarial insight, it becomes simply a matter of lay judgments as to whether these promises can be fulfilled. The promises are made because they're reasonable promises that people need to have peace of mind as they age. But whether the resources will be there to fulfill those promises is something that actuaries are best equipped to analyze. Although accountants rely on engineers, they've been reluctant to rely on actuaries. Accountancy and actuarial practice differ in their philosophical underpinnings. The accounting focus is on the enterprise as a whole and how it is performing as a going concern. That accords with the interests of the executive and the board. They want the facility, the CCRC, to continue for their tenure. The board members want to feel that they've fulfilled the obligations of their oversight function, and so they want to see the CCRC continue and thrive, and the executives want it to continue at least for the duration of their careers so that they're not out of work. Actuaries focus on the fulfillment of the promises made to residents, equity interests among residents, and pricing adequacy to provide the promised benefits to residents. These are matters primarily of interest to residents. The executives and the board may also be interested if they are seeking to fulfill their stewardship obligations toward the residents. They may also become interested if mistrust begins to impact resident perceptions and market acceptance. But it's more common for the executives and the board to rely on simple accounting, which may seem plausible but can have difficulties, than exposing themselves to the more complex understandings that actuaries bring to these institutions. Actuarial analysis, like engineering, is mathematical. In recent years, accounting practice has come to be largely determined by a set of rules developed by the Financial Accounting Standards Board, also known as FASB, F-A-S-B, pronounced FASB, and promulgated as accounting standards codifications. That's the term that the FASB, which is the quasi-legislative body of the accountants, the rules-making body, uses for the rules that it issues. They're called accounting standards codifications. Although there is some correlation of the accounting standards codifications with value measurement, the resulting rules can be problematic, which then calls into question the integrity of the financial statements. We need only think of Enron to realize the consequences. Most people have been led to think of accounting as principled, so it is difficult for non-financial people to grasp that accounting is defined by rules which can be arbitrary, as any legislation has an arbitrary element to it. Once it's enacted, you have to conform with it, whether you feel that the rule makes sense or it doesn't make sense. After all, the term generally accepted accounting principles, affectionately known as GAAP, is used to describe the accounting standards codification's complex of rules, as though calling rules principles would make it so. A simple example illustrates the difference. Buildings are commonly depreciated on a straight line basis over 50 years. In practice, we know that most buildings are usable for more than 50 years. The accounting rule is simply an arbitrary judgment about how long the building is expected to be usable. The actuarial approach, which is not typically used for something like a building, but if an actuary were to be asked to project the duration of a building, he would develop a contingency table, the probability that the building would last 50 years or 60 years or 100 years, what the investments would be needed along the way for maintenance, what's the probability that the economics would change and render the building obsolete in the interim, what the discounted value would be of the resulting cash flows, so that a refined appraisal of that value of that building on a contingent basis could be made. This is not typically used in our general business practice today, although it might be. And during World War II, when matters of life expectancy of parts and that sort of thing was critical, actuaries were recruited to come to Washington to serve in the War Department, and they were instrumental in the early origination of the science of operations research, which does look into that kind of contingency for physical properties. However, that's beyond what we're saying here. I'm just drawing the comparison between the accounting reliance on a rule that says that a building lasts 50 years and then is gone, with the actuarial analysis, which creates a more complex mathematical model to try to get closer to the truth of the matter at issue. How does this apply to continuing care retirement communities? Accountants have sought to simplify continuing care retirement community revenue recognition as they have simplified other complexities like depreciation. The reasonable expectation for residents is that the entrance fees will be prudently managed together with the recurring fees to provide the promised benefits. Let's pause for a minute and think about that. The reasonable expectation for residents is that the entrance fees will be prudently managed together with the recurring fees to provide the promised benefits. The residents move into a community expecting that they're going to pay a substantial entrance fee, in return for which they can have the assurance that they will not be a burden on others toward the end of their lives. They won't have to turn to their children for support. They won't become wards of the state or likely have to go on Medi-Cal. That their commitment to the continuing care retirement community and its structure of fees will be sufficient to sustain them for their lives. The effect of the simplified accounting rules, however, is to accelerate the recognition of entrance fees as revenue so that they can be fully expended before some of the more costly benefits promised to residents fall due. In other words, that entrance fee can be taken into income as though it was available to be used to pay expenses more quickly than the rate at which it would be earned by an actuarial analysis or even by the rules of accounting principles, the historical rules which matched revenues to the obligations that they were intended to fund. That has been revised by the rulemaking body for CCRCs so that earnings are front-ended, or earnings are accelerated to the early years of the community, and that can then lead to a shortfall in later years, say 10, 11, 12 years into the life of a community, and the provider is likely then to scramble to increase the recurring fees to residents to make up for that shortfall that is merely an artifact of the nature of the accounting that is used. An example of the kind of promised benefit that comes late in life and that the residents expect will be funded is the availability of nursing care toward the end of life. By the time residents reach that point, they are becoming frail and they may be vulnerable. They may not have the same acuity of judgment that they had when they were younger. They expect that the trust that they have placed in the continuing care retirement community will be enough to fulfill that obligation with a reasonable relationship of value to the services provided. That's the expectation. This distorted early recognition of entrance fees as spendable is incorporated into the CCRC accounting rules promulgated by the Financial Accounting Standards Board. I suppose that a conscientious provider can follow a more actuarial financial standard and could employ actuaries to determine the value of the contingent liabilities, and some may actually do that, although my understanding is that most CCRCs follow the Financial Accounting Standards Board guidance for the revenue recognition for continuing care retirement communities according to the accounting standards codifications applicable to that industry and to that industry exclusively. These standards are not consistent with the way similar liabilities are funded and accounted for in other industries. The accounting standards codifications promulgated for the continuing care retirement community are unique to that industry and that industry alone. Actuaries are not bound in the same way by rules as the accountants are, although actuaries do aspire to follow principles of sound judgment. Actuaries generally aspire to a higher ideal than mere adherence to a set of rules. Actuaries are expected to think through from first principles the full complexity of the continuing care retirement community. An example would be the kind of complex modeling that I spoke of earlier in connection with the development of a building. The actuaries are expected to really think about what it is that they're modeling, not to just follow some rule from a rule book, but to actually think about it and make a judgment as to whether the assumptions for mortality and morbidity, for withdrawal and other contingencies of a continuing care community's operation are appropriate for the particular continuing care retirement community being modeled. Now, some people say, well, there isn't a sufficient spread of risk among the residents of a continuing care community to make such an exercise reasonable. That's a little disingenuous. Actuaries are skilled in the stochastic tools that allow them to glean from looking at the particular circumstances of the CCRC population to determine what is the appropriate calculation, and where a spread of risk is needed, there are available tools of reinsurance and other financial tools which can be used to get to the needed level of predictability that can allow the continuing care retirement community to operate soundly. The high standard followed by actuaries, really required of them by their profession, results in a process of continuous improvement in actuarial determinations. Clearly, you start out by making a set of assumptions, and then you monitor how the actual experience is emerging relative to the assumptions, and this becomes a continuously refined process so that the knowledge of how the matter is developing and the financial security for the residents is continuously improving with the annual involvement, or more frequent if needed, involvement of the actuaries. An actuarial evaluation of a continuing care retirement community identifies the asset value that the continuing care retirement community needs to have to best ensure that the promises and commitments made to the residents can be met. The nature of the assets is secondary as long as there is sufficient liquidity or credit to meet obligations as they fall due. Now, this again requires a little elaboration. Typically, a CCRC involves a building, and there has to be an investment made in that building. debt may be incurred to build the building, and when the entrance fees come in from the initial set of residents, they may be used to pay down the debt so that the debt service is less, and that results in fewer interest charges against the community. That can be a wise decision, but there needs to still be a match between the value of that building on an operating basis to the value of the promises made to the residents, so that there's some assurance that those promises can be fulfilled. And if the entrance fees are used in a way that reduces the interest paid by the facility, the residents are entitled to the benefit of that savings, that investment return on their entrance fees. If they were to move to a pure rental community where you just paid month to month, then the money that they would otherwise have put into an entrance fee would be available to them to earn investment returns, which would help them to meet that rental burden. They shouldn't be deprived of that value in the entrance fee, the interest earnings, the investment earnings on those entrance fees, or the interest costs foregone as a result of the use of the entrance fees, merely because they've moved to an entrance fee community. There should be a seamless integration between the rental model and the entrance fee model for senior housing. So the use of those assets, they might be used for the buildings. That creates some lack of liquidity, so the actuaries need to project the liquidity needs of the organization over time to ensure that there is sufficient liquidity, which may be handled in the form of simply cash management by the managers of the facility, or it could be provided by a letter of credit. If an actuarial valuation reveals a prospective deficiency, in other words, if the value of the promises made to the residents is more than the assets available to meet the promises, even allowing for the future fees that the residents are expected to pay, in that case, then there's a deficiency. It means that the pricing has not been adequate to provide the benefits promised, and something has to be done. If the actuarial valuation reveals such a deficiency, early detection gives the board and the executives the widest latitude to restore soundness. When a CCRC is found to be impaired, it is prudent to develop a plan to correct the impairment. But the involvement of actuaries in the conceptualization and management of a CCRC from the outset is the best safeguard against such a deficiency calamity, just as sound engineering is the best safeguard against failure for a physical product. You may be asking, who is a qualified actuary? Actuaries are not licensed, and so it's essential that the person using actuarial services, and they're generally sophisticated parties like CCRC executives, that they look into the qualifications of the actuary to be sure that the actuary has the qualifications needed to make the analyses required. The most highly qualified actuaries for CCRC analyses are fellows of the Society of Actuaries. Now, there's more than one actuarial organization, and most people who are fellows of the Society of Actuaries are also members of the American Academy of Actuaries. The American Academy of Actuaries is the recognition arm. It's really a political arm of the actuarial profession. It was formed to provide an umbrella organization to bring together people who claim to be providing actuarial services and to provide some standard for how they can act. Most fellows of the Society of Actuaries are also members of the American Academy of Actuaries. The American Academy of Actuaries is the political arm of the actuarial profession. The society, which used to fulfill both roles, has more recently confined itself to education and research activities, and it is the organization that ensures that actuaries who are fellows of the Society of Actuaries are highly qualified, ethical people who could be trusted to do competent work in the area of their expertise. So a fellow of the Society of Actuaries who is a continuing care retirement community expert, it is the ideal. There are other people who are often associates of the Society of Actuaries who, while they have not met the highest standard of qualification for actuaries, are still considered by virtue of their experience to be sufficiently informed to be effective counselors and to carry out these complex calculations which involve a very high degree of trust. Let me explain a little bit about the distinction, since this may be confusing. Associates are people who've mastered most of the mathematical tools that actuaries need to function. In other words, the basic actuarial mathematics. They're qualified in statistics, they're qualified in contingencies, they're qualified in sources of data for human life, contingent matters, and that sort of thing. The later examinations leading to fellowship involve the practical ramifications and some of the understanding of how these things are used within a business or societal context. And the Academy of Actuaries does develop standards which are somewhat like these accounting standards, but most actuaries exceed the requirements of those standards. The standards tend to be limited to current practice, and actuaries pride themselves on advancing the benefits of the work in their field, their profession, and so they're called to a higher standard than mere compliance with these requirements, although that really sort of sets a minimum, since the Academy is an umbrella organization that can allow people to have a somewhat lesser qualification standard. It's desirable to have these minimum standards for what would constitute a capable practice. But anyone who relies on work done by an experienced actuary with long years working in the continuing care retirement community field, who is a fellow of the Society of Actuaries, will be well assured of having competent actuarial advice. How does this affect you if you are a prospective resident? Well, you can have greater assurance of the financial soundness of the community that you are entrusting with your entrance fee payment if the financial standing of the community involves actuarial analysis, and if an actuary has attested to the overall financial stability and soundness of the continuing care retirement community. How does it affect you if you're a current resident? If the standards of the continuing care retirement community do not measure up to what you feel would be sufficient to provide you the assurance that you need to have peace of mind, then you need to be sure to set aside sufficient personal reserves to cover any costs that might arise if the community should encounter financial difficulty and have to accelerate future fee increases, or if other circumstances were to arise concerning that community. Also, if you have a less than full care contract, say a type B or type C contract, then you should set aside personal reserves in addition to the reserves you might otherwise wish to have to assure that you don't become a burden, to cover that potential cost that a type A life care, full care contract provides. A reasonable expectation, this, if you're providing for this from your personal resources, it has to be more than just the average. You have to cover the worst case situation because you don't know what your own personal situation might be. A life care community can price it based on averages and use reinsurance to cover its risk. But if you're covering the risk as you would in a type C contract, then you either have to have available sufficient long-term care insurance to cover the risk, and typically a long-term care insurance contract might cover half the exposure, so you'd still have the other half for yourself. You can use as a rough rule of thumb of what is an appropriate amount to have an allowance of 1,500 days times whatever the provider currently charges for skilled nursing home confinement, in other words, care center confinement, less whatever your long-term care insurance would cover. That can give you a rough order of magnitude of the personal financial responsibility that you might have over and above whatever you have to cover the financial exposure that the community has if it's less than fully actuarially funded. If you are a provider, executive, or board member, the best thing would be to ask a fully qualified actuary with continuing care retirement community experience to come talk with your group and to go over what the need would be. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, I'm an actuary, but I am not working in this field. I'm now a resident in a continuing care retirement community, and my interest is solely in ensuring that continuing care retirement communities are actuarially sound and actuarially well managed. Let's say you're a student considering becoming an actuary. Congratulations. It's a very demanding field. It's not for everyone. If you were near the top of your class and you always excelled at mathematics and you're exceptionally articulate, then you may be able to qualify in the actuarial field. But the entrance to this field is on the basis of examinations, and these examinations are demanding. They're comparable to A-level work at a top college. Nothing less came. These are not examinations in which one squeaks through. The plus is that you can qualify on your merits. Coursework is not essential. The exams are anonymously graded. Nobody knows who you are. They're only going to know the quality of your mastery of the material essential to the practice of the actuarial profession. You will have to study many, many hours, often 400 hours or more for a single exam, and there are many exams in the course of study. But your career will be very satisfying. Actuaries try not to take sides. They pride themselves on their objectivity and their bias. As one president of the Society of Actuaries said not long ago, we won't tell you whether we agree or disagree with the position you're taking, but we can tell you whether it might be practical in practice. This involves an understanding of a political context and an understanding particularly of the mathematics involved and the reasonable approaches. It's quite different from economics, which simply involves a regression projection of how things are likely to evolve. Actuaries are not only concerned with the adequacy of their results, but with the equity for those who are affected by the contracts that they are modeling or the commitments that are undertaken. Your career will be one that will make full use of your talent, and you'll be able to use your considerable ability to help others. That can be very satisfying. Actuarial work is a service profession, and you will feel great satisfaction in being able to help others to understand these complex financial products, these complex financial undertakings, and to see them soundly administered for the benefit of other people. Congratulations on your willingness to take on the rigors of the qualification process, and we hope that you will enjoy your career, and you can rest assured that there's no more satisfying area of your career than helping people as they age to have full financial security, that the savings that they've made over their productive years are sufficient to allow them to have a dignified aging process, a dignified old age, without being a burden on others.